Jungle Book, Part 8. Now we must go back to the last tale, but one. When Mowgli left the wolf's cave, after the fight with the pack at Council Rock. He went down to the plowed lands where the villagers lived, but he would not stop there, because it was too near to the jungle, and he knew that he had made at least one bad enemy at the council. So he hurried on, keeping to the rough road that ran down the valley, and followed it at a steady jog-trot for nearly 20 miles, till he came to a country that he did not know. The valley opened up into a great plain, dotted over with rocks and cut up by ravines. At one end stood a little village, and at the other a thick jungle came down to sweep the grazing grounds, and stopped there as though it had been cut off with a hoe. All over the plain, cattle and buffaloes were grazing, and when the little boys in charge of the herd saw Mowgli, they shouted and ran away, and the yellow pariah dogs that hang out in every Indian village barked. Mowgli walked on, for he was feeling hungry, and when he came to the village gate he saw a big thorn bush that was drawn up before the gate at twilight, pushed to one side. "Umph," he said, for he had come across more than one such barricade in his night rambles after things to eat. "So men are afraid of the people of the jungle here also." He sat down by the gate, and when a man came out, he stood up, opened his mouth, and pointed down into it to show that he wanted food. The man stared and ran back to one of the street of the village, shouting for the priest, who was a big fat man dressed in white, with a red and yellow mark on his forehead. The priest came to the gate, and with him at least 100 people, who stared and talked and shouted and pointed at Mowgli. "They have no manners, these men folk," said Mowgli to himself. "Only the gray ape would behave as they do." So he threw back his long hair and frowned at the crowd. "What is there to be afraid of?" said the priest. "Look at the marks on his arms and legs. They are the bites of wolves. He is but a wolf child run away from the jungle." Of course, in playing together, the cubs had often nipped Mowgli harder than they intended, and there were white scars all over his arms and legs. But he would have been the last person in the world to call these bites, for he knew what real biting meant. "Ari, Ari," said 2 or 3 women together, "to be bitten by wolves, poor child! He is a handsome boy. He has eyes like red fire. By honor, Masusa, he is not unlike thy boy that was taken by the tiger." "Let me look," said a woman with heavy copper rings on her wrists and ankles. She peered at Mowgli from under the palm of her hand. "Indeed he is not. He is thinner, but he has the very look of my boy." The priest was a clever man, and knew that Musa was wife to the richest villager in the place, so he looked up at the sky for a minute and then said solemnly, "What the jungle has taken, the jungle has restored. Take the boy into thy house, my sister, and forget not to honor the priest who sees so far into the lives of men." "By the bull that brought me," said Mowgli to himself, "but all this talking is like another looking over by the pack. Well, if I am a man I must become." The crowd parted as the woman beckoned Mowgli to her hut, where there was a red lacquered bedstand and a great earthen grain chest with curious raised patterns on it, 6 copper cooking pots, and an image of a Hindu god in the little alcove, and on the wall a real looking glass such as they sell in the country fairs. She gave him a long drink of milk and some bread, and then laid her hand on his head and looked into his eyes, for she thought perhaps that he might be her real son come back from the jungle where the tiger had taken him. So she said, "Nathu, oh Nathu." Mowgli did not show that he knew the name. "Thou dost not remember the day when I gave thee thy new shoes?" She touched his foot, and it was almost as hard as horn. "No," she said very sorrowfully. "These feet have never worn shoes. But thou art very like my Nathu, and thou shalt be my son." Mowgli was uneasy because he'd never been under a roof before, but as he looked at the thatch, he saw he could tear it out at any time if he wanted to get away, and that the window had no fastenings. "What is the good of a man," he said to himself at last, "if he does not understand man's talk? Now I am as silly and dumb as a man would be with us in the jungle. I must learn their talk." It was not for fun that he had learned while he was with the wolves to imitate the challenge of bucks in the jungle and the grunt of the little wild pig, but as soon as Masusa pronounced a word, Mowgli would imitate it almost perfectly, and before dark he had learned the names of many things in the hut. There was a difficulty at bedtime, because Mowgli would not sleep under anything that looked like a panther trap as that hut, and when they shut the door, he went through the window. "Give him his will," said Masusa's husband. "Remember, he can never till now have slept on a bed. If he is indeed sent in the place of our son, he will not run away." So Mowgli stretched out himself in some long, clean grass at the edge of the field, but before he had closed his eyes, a soft gray nose poked him under the chin. "Whew!" said Gray Brother, for he was the eldest of Mother's wolf cubs. "This is a poor reward for following thee 20 miles. Thou smellest of wood smoke and cattle, and altogether like a man already. Wake, little brother. I bring news." "Are all well in the jungle?" said Mowgli, hugging him. "All except the wolves that were burned with the red flower. Now listen. Shere Khan has gone away to hunt, far off till his coat grows again, for he is badly singed. When he returns, he swears that he will lay thy bones in the Wahunga. There are 2 words to that. I have made a little promise, but the news is always good. I am tired tonight, very tired with new things, Gray Brother, but bring me the news always. Thou wilt not forget that thou art a wolf? Men will not make thee forget?" said Gray Brother anxiously. "Never. I will always remember that I love thee and all of our cave, but I will also remember that I have been cast out of the pack, and that thou must be cast out of another pack. Men are only men, little brother, and their talk is the talk of frogs in a pond. And when I come down here again, I will wait for thee in the bamboos at the edge of the grazing ground." For 3 months after that night, Mowgli hardly ever left the village gate. He was so busy learning the ways and customs of men. First he had to wear a cloth around him, which annoyed him horribly, and then he had to learn about money, which he did not in the least understand, and about plowing, of which he did not see the use. And then the little children in the village made him very angry. Luckily, the law of the jungle had taught him to keep his temper, for in the jungle, life and food depended on keeping your temper. But when they made fun of him because he would not play games or fly kites, or because he mispronounced some word, only the knowledge that it was unsportsmanlike to kill little naked cubs kept him from picking them up and breaking them in 2. He did not know his own strength in the least. In the jungle he knew he was weak compared with the beast, but in the village people said he was as strong as a bull. And Mowgli had not the faintest idea of the difference that caste makes between man and man. When the potter's donkey slipped in the clay pit, Mowgli hauled it out by the tail and helped stack the pots for their journey to the market at Koanhara. It was very shocking, too, for the potter is a low-caste man, and his donkey is worse. When the priest scolded him, Mowgli threatened to put him on the donkey, too, and the priest told Masusa's husband that Mowgli had better set to work as soon as possible. And the village head man told Mowgli that he would have to go out with the buffaloes the next day and herd them while they grazed. No one was more pleased than Mowgli. And that night, because he had been appointed a servant of the village, as it were, he went off to a circle that met every evening on a masonry platform under a great fig tree. It was the village club, and the headman and watchman and the barber, who all knew the gossip of the village, and old Bladoo and the village hunter, who had a tower musket, met and smoked. The monkey sat and talked in the upper branches, and there was a hole in the platform where a cobra lived. He had his little platter of milk every night because he was sacred, and the old man sat around the tree and talked, and pulled at the big hugwas, the water pipes, till far into the night. They told wonderful tales of gods and men and ghosts, and Bladoo even told more wonderful ones of the ways of beast in the jungle, till the eyes of most of the children were sitting outside the circle bulged out of their heads. Most of the tales were about animals, for the jungle was always at their door. The deer and the wild pig grubbed up their crops, and now and then a tiger carried off a man at twilight within the sight of the village gates. Mowgli, who naturally knew something about what they were talking of, had to cover his face not to show that he was laughing, while Bladoo and the tower musket across his knees climbed from one wonderful story to another. Mowgli's shoulders shook. Bladoo was explaining how the tiger that had carried away Masusa's son was a ghost tiger, and his body was inhabited by the ghost of a wicked old moneylender who had died some years ago. And I know that this is true, he said, because Purun Das always limped from the blow that he'd gotten in a riot when his account books were burned. And the tiger that I speak of, he limps too, for the tracks of his pads are unequal. True, true, that must be the truth, said the greybeards, nodding all together. Are all these tales such cobwebs and moon talk? Said Mowgli. The tiger limps because he was born lame, as everyone knows. To talk of the soul of a moneylender and a beast that never had the courage of a jackal is child's talk. Buldeo was speechless with surprise for a moment. Then the head man stared. Oh, it is the jungle brat, is it? Said Buldeo. If thou art so wise, better to bring his hide to Kunahara, for the government has set 100 rupees on his life. Better still, do not talk when thy elders speak. Mowgli rose to go. All the evening I have lain here listening, he called back over his shoulder, and except once or twice, Buldeo has not said a word of truth concerning the jungle, which is at his very doors. How, then, shall I believe the tales of ghosts and gods and goblins which he said he has seen? It is full time that boy went to herding, said the head man, and Buldeo puffed and snorted at Mowgli's impertinence.